Portable fighting games and my channel go hand in hand, as I've talked about quite a few of them in previous videos, although I haven't talked about fighting games on the Game Boy. The Game Boy Color? Sure, I've mentioned a few fighting games on that system from time to time, but I've never covered the original Game Boy. First released in 1989, Nintendo's handheld was— you get the point, so let's just skip the history lesson. If it wasn't obvious by now, we're going to be covering some fighting games that were released on the original Game Boy, 4 of them to be exact, to not only compare them to their arcade and home console versions, but to also see if any of them are still fun today. The Game Boy's limited button layout and lack of a backlight means that the system is quite possibly the least optimal way to ever play fighting games, and this has made me very morbidly curious, so let's not waste any more time and jump into our first game. As arguably the most famous fighting game of all time, Street Fighter II set the world ablaze with its popularity, and a little known fact is that the game was the direct cause of the fall of the USSR, believe it or not. It goes without saying that everyone and their deceased grandmother knows about Street Fighter II, so in typical Capcom fashion, they ported the game to 1,000,001 different systems. Famously, the Game Boy also received a port of the game, and even though I've played a lot of Street Fighter II over the years, I've never actually played this version of the game before. There are 9 characters here, including 3 of the 4 boss characters, believe it or not. E Honda, Dhalsim, and Vega don't make appearances in this version, but I can live without them personally. Also, despite the box art leading you to believe that this is based on the regular Street Fighter II, its inclusion of Sagat, Balrog, and M. Bison lead me to believe that it's actually a version of Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting. I'm not sure if the game balance and the move properties are the same between these 2 versions, and to be honest, I don't think I possess the human will to try and figure it out. Although the game's visuals and the audio are completely different from the game's home ports, and obviously the arcade version, the biggest difference is the brand new control scheme. As the Game Boy only has 2 buttons, having to figure out how to make a 6-button fighting game work on the system must have been a nightmare for Capcom, and they took some creative liberties in the gameplay department as a result. You have 1 button for punches and 1 button for kicks, although traditional motion inputs remain for special moves. If you want to do heavy attacks though, you have to hold the buttons down longer than usual, and I personally found this to be pretty unresponsive. Trying to do regular moves with the game's input delay is hard enough, but having to hold down the buttons for a specific amount of time threw me for a loop. I also found it hard to differentiate between special move strengths because of the reduced animation quality, so overall the controls are my biggest criticism of the game. I also did some research online, and I found a webpage claiming that the game runs at less than 10 frames a second, so if this is true, I totally understand now why it feels so jank to play. Due to me playing on an emulator, I can't comment on how the motion inputs feel when doing them on the Game Boy itself, but I didn't have any issues with the game's input reading overall when attempting to practice the game on a regular controller. What I did have issues with, however, is the game's delay in actual matches. Whether you're actively playing against another person or the AI, it feels like there's a whole second of input delay, and even trying to do something as simple as throwing out a punch is very frustrating. Despite this, I was able to somehow consistently throw out special moves, and I have no idea how, what with the input delay and the low frame rate. Characters also don't move around the screen as smoothly as they do in any of the other versions of Street Fighter II, so there's a lot of jittering going on here too. In terms of content, this version of the game has Arcade Mode, Versus, and Survival. These last 2 modes are actually really impressive for an original Game Boy game to have, and the former can be accessed via a Game Boy Link cable or by playing it on a Super Game Boy. As a side note, I played the game via this method, which is why the game has more color than usual. I can also imagine that during Street Fighter II Mania in the 90s, a lot of kids would have had a lot of fun playing each other with this version if they didn't have access to the arcade or the home ports, so I can't fault its inclusion. Fighting games need multiplayer after all, so it's amazing how Capcom managed to include it here. Survival is exactly like how it sounds. You pick a character and you fight the AI until you run out of life. It's nothing out of the ordinary, but for a Game Boy title from 1995, it's a nice addition as it does provide some decent replay value. I also feel the need to mention the game's audio. The soundtrack for this version is essentially just 8-bit versions of the regular Street Fighter II music, but I actually kind of like it. I vastly preferred the arcade version soundtrack, but the audio here was well done, and I was able to easily tell each song apart from each other. The backgrounds are also well done too. Look, I'm not gonna lie to you and say they're full of detail, but they look decent enough, so I can't complain. Overall, while this version of the game is pretty much the worst way to play Street Fighter II in my opinion, it's still an interesting part of Street Fighter history, but I just wish there was less input delay. If the game was more responsive, then it would have been so much better, even if everything else about it remained the exact same. As the King of Fighters has always been about teams of 3 characters fighting each other with a 4-button layout, I had no idea how the series would translate over to the Game Boy going into this. The King of Fighters 95 received a Game Boy port in 1997, making it 2 years younger than Street Fighter II's Game Boy conversion. Right off the bat, this game also uses the system where you hold down a button for a heavier attack, and although it's not as bad as the system found in Street Fighter II on the Game Boy, I still had a little bit of trouble getting it to work here. I understand that it's literally impossible for this game to have heavy attacks on their own buttons, but I wish the developers went with another control method if one even exists. There are 17 characters here, at least in the beginning, more on that later, each with their own unique moves and audio. Whether you like Kyo, Iori, Terry, or even Ralph, a healthy amount of fan favorite characters make an appearance in this port. Just like Street Fighter 2 on the Game Boy, the characters here each have a bunch of special moves that require you to do the motion inputs found in the arcade version, and I think that this is a cool inclusion. In typical KOF fashion, this port also contains super bars for each character. When it's filled up, you can perform a devastation super move, and they look pretty cool. Having to do inputs like these on the Game Boy to perform such moves sounds frustrating, but I was actually able to do them with ease, thankfully. Much to my surprise, I was able to get all the moves out consistently due to the frame rate not being that bad, so this game actually feels pretty nice to play. Another aspect I really enjoy about this game is how all the characters have been downsized. The sprites in the arcade version of KOF 95 are large and they contain a lot of detail, so the decision to simplify them to maintain a higher frame rate on the Game Boy was a very smart decision. Detailed graphics don't mean anything if the game's performance is as responsive as a geriatric grandparent after all. Despite the characters' small sizes, I was easily able to tell each of their moves apart from each other, and all the retro sound effects were really cool too. Every character here looks and sounds great, and seeing their iconic moves on the tiny Game Boy screen is pretty amusing. When it comes to the modes present, you can do an arcade mode run with a single character or a team of 3. I had a good time playing against the AI with my favorite characters in the beginning, but it does get old pretty quickly. There's only so many times I can fight against an AI that exhibits the same patterns, and there's also nothing here that I haven't seen before. All of this means that the game has next to no long-term realistic replay value, as you feel like you've seen everything the game has to offer before your first run of arcade mode is even over. A lot of the game's fun factor comes from trying out all the characters and seeing how they were translated into a Game Boy title, and although the character roster is actually pretty good, I think most players will exclusively stick with their mains. On a more positive note, I really like the game's presentation. The intro movie is super well done, and I also enjoy the game's stages. They're very large, and they each have a unique theme, helping them to stand apart from one another. The game also has a really cool screen shake effect when you land a throw or a powerful special move, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't love this. It's a very small detail, but it goes a long way towards making the game feel impactful, even if it's running at a super low resolution. All of this is well and good, but we haven't even gotten to my favorite part yet. KOF 95 on Game Boy has a ton of cool secrets, and they range from beating the game on a certain difficulty to unlock hidden characters, to even pressing a button string to unlock teams of the same character. If we press select 3 times on the screen, for example, we can unlock Rugal and Saishu as secret characters. If you manage to press select 20 times, then you can also unlock Nakaruru from Samurai Showdown. You can even enable infinite super meter if you'd like, and if you're like me, you'll have a blast trying all the game's codes out. They each do different things, and I'm really happy with their inclusion in the game. Although the thrill does wear off pretty quickly, I think that this game dunks on Street Fighter 2's Game Boy port, mainly due to its smoother input reading. I also didn't experience any major input delay, which made performing supers and special moves really easy. I really enjoyed my time with it though, and it was a lot of fun playing through the game to record footage, so I highly recommend it. Oh yeah, now we're getting into the good stuff. Killer Instinct was totally unlike anything else when it was released in the arcades around the world in 1994, mainly due to its 3D sprites and emphasis on gigantic combos that dynamically shifted the camera in real time. Despite being announced for the Nintendo 64, or the Ultra 64 as it was known by at the time, KI eventually found its way over to the Super Nintendo. The game's visuals and audio took a massive hit, but it still had the classic 6-button gameplay and characters that fans loved. Plus, who could forget Killer Cuts? For some reason, probably as a bad joke that went way too far, Killer Instinct was also ported to the Game Boy in 1995, the same year as the SNES port. Oh boy, where do I even begin? First off, awesome lightning strikes revealed the title screen. Secondly, some of the arcade version's character roster is missing, so you can say goodbye to classic figures like Cinder. Riptor also doesn't make an appearance here, but the other 8 characters do, thankfully. I was skeptical at first, but the characters here feel pretty accurate to their arcade and Super Nintendo counterparts, which would have been no easy task for the developers. We can also immediately tell that much of the animation quality and sprite details were heavily scaled back for the Game Boy, and I'm pretty sure this poor system would have exploded if it tried to render one of the arcade characters. I know I sound like a broken record by now, but just bear with me when I ask the following. As the original game has 6 buttons, how does the Game Boy port get around this? At this point in the video, I've essentially conditioned you to think that this game has the button hold system, but it actually doesn't. Instead, you get heavy attacks by pressing the buttons normally, and lights up performance by pressing the button while holding forward. If this sounds very finicky, it's because it is, and I just couldn't get used to it. A major part of Killer Instinct are its awesome combos where you chain special moves and strings of normal attacks called auto doubles together, before finishing the combo with a big endo. This general combo structure is still in this port, but the control scheme makes it very hard to perform certain normals and neutral, and also specials and combos. Speaking of combos, not every special move from the original game made it in here, meaning that some characters do have less combo potential than before. If you're good enough, you're still able to perform some awesome looking attack strings, and despite the game displaying only a few colors at a time at a really low resolution, it still feels amazing when you do one of these combos. Killer Instinct on Game Boy also has some nice content. Arcade mode and versus multiplayer are here, but there's also a training mode. You can't mess with any settings to control the training dummy, but it's still a nice mode to have. Being able to wail on the training dummy as I record footage makes my job easier, so a big thank you to the developers for including this mode. Much like the previous games, the content present here does get a bit stale, so I hope you have a friend to play with. Also, while the game's presentation and menus are nowhere near as detailed as the arcade version due to technical limitations, they still get the job done, and I had no issues interacting with them. Before I move on, I'd be an idiot if I skipped over the music. Killer Instinct has always had a fantastic soundtrack, especially the 2013 entry into the series, and the music here is pretty good too. Hearing these classic tunes being turned into old school 8-bit sounding renditions was super enjoyable. The only complaint I have about the game's audio is that the game's classic announcer is missing. Look, I understand that this is due to hardware reasons, and that a human's voice coming through the Game Boy sound chip would probably sound like a vocoder being waterboarded, but I still miss him. Okay, this is all fantastic so far, but what about the characters specifically? Whether you like warrior Tibetan monks, killer robots, ice aliens, or even boxers, there's a lot of character variety here, and it means that everyone can find a character that they like. As Cinder isn't in this port, I went with Jago for arcade mode, and despite my issues with the game's control scheme, Jago overall feels pretty nice to play. He still has his fireball, DP, Tatsu, and even his laser sword shows up here, so it was very enjoyable using him, especially when I could do an ultra combo. Yep, that's right, ultra combos are in this port. I found them a little bit unresponsive as they sometimes wouldn't come out despite me doing the input for them, but I still love how they're here. The other characters are also quite fun to use, and even though I can't reliably do charge moves to save my life, it was fun doing big combos with Glacius. I didn't realize it at first, but Killer Instinct on Game Boy is actually a somewhat legitimate fighting game for the system. The visuals and audio may have been watered down, but the gameplay wasn't, so all of the gameplay strategies from the original release apply here as well. Now that I think about it, everything I'd be doing on the arcade version of KI is readily available for me to do here too, so if you can get used to the weird control scheme, there's a lot of fun to be had here, seriously. I'm not going to act like this game is going to cure my heart disease or anything, but this port genuinely surprised me with its attention to detail and accuracy to its source material, which is a must for ports of games to technologically inferior hardware. The development team at Rareware attempted to bring Killer Instinct, warts and all, to the Game Boy, and if you ask me, they absolutely succeeded. This is definitely the best game so far in the video. Before we get into the final game of the video, let me sit down for a bit and let you in on something. This next game is going to suck hard. It's going to suck like a thirsty vacuum cleaner, and I think that it's one of the worst portable games that I've ever played. This game is good, this game is good, this game is good, but this game? Yeah, it's Shak Fu Time. Released in 1995, 1 year after its home console release on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, Shak Fu is a Game Boy port of one of the worst games ever created. I'm sure we all know about this game, so I went into this with expectations so low that saying they were buried 6 feet under the ground would be an understatement. For starters, Shak Fu has a story mode, a mode where you can fight the AI, and multiplayer. Unlike the previous games that support local multiplayer through the Game Boy's link cable accessory, the only way to do multiplayer here is to use the Super Game Boy, and I highly doubt anyone bought one of these with the specific purpose of running a Shak Fu bracket. Although the home console version has cutscenes for its story mode, these have been removed from the Game Boy version. Selecting this mode on the menu instantly takes you to a loading screen for the first battle, and I can't say I have any idea why Shak is fighting all these weird creatures. There are 7 characters here, and while it's super tempting to stick with Shak since he's the main character, I didn't mind the other characters. We have a giant beast, a mummy, someone that looks like Kimberly from Street Fighter 6, and Jan Lee from Dead or Alive, so at least there's some character variety here. They all have unique sprites and moves, and I suppose you could find a main if you can somehow put up with the controls. Much like Killer Instinct, this version has different attack types mapped to certain directional inputs. Pressing the buttons normally gives you light attacks, whereas holding back and pressing them gives you heavier attacks. If you know anything about the home console version of Shak Fu, you'll know that it has horrific input delay and input reading, and while it's not perfect, it's somewhat better here. Don't get me wrong, it still handles as well as a drunk driver speeding through a school zone, but at least I didn't have to wait 3 to 5 business days for my inputs to be detected. I had an extremely hard time getting the most basic special moves to come out, but at least doing normals was easy. Due to the lowered visual quote-unquote quality of the original game being heavily scaled back here, I could barely tell what was going on half the time. The previous games we've covered so far in the video all have strong key poses for their character animations, and this helps us visually process what the characters are doing. In Shak Fu, however, there are none, so everything looked incredibly confusing to me. Everything moves so fast here, and even after reading through the game's instruction booklet, I had no idea what any of the moves are. You never know when to block, jump, attack, etc., and it means that the game has a very steep learning curve as nothing is intuitive. If you want to truly understand all the game's moves, you're gonna have to look them up online, and I honestly think that most people would rather not do this, and I can't blame them. Going back to the game's content for a bit, there's honestly no reason to keep coming back to this game. I really don't think anyone would be excited to pop the Shak Fu cartridge into their Game Boy to fight against the AI, and as there are less than 10 characters here, you start to feel the monotony setting in extremely quickly. The horrible gameplay and bland character roster leaves much to be desired, and if you were a fighting game fan with a Game Boy back in the day, I think that jumping out of the building would be a better choice. Okay, look, jokes aside, it was clear to everyone on Earth that a Game Boy port of Shak Fu was going to suck no matter what, and aside from money, I really have no idea why this port was even created. It's not as if the home console game was received well on launch and then had its reputation soured over time, so I think that even back in 1995, the average person knew not to touch this game with a 10-foot pole. Despite all this, I did have a bit of fun with the game in a sort of self-loathing and nihilistic way. I'm genuinely convinced that the sadomasochist Kakihara from the 2001 film Ichi the Killer would derive extreme amounts of pleasure from this game, and it reminds me of the phrase, "it's so bad that it's good." Shak Fu is so awful that it even fails to meet this criteria, but poking fun at the game has given me a good laugh, so now I'm trapped in a philosophical Ouroboros where I don't know if making fun of the game for my own self-benefit means that I like the game, or if I dislike the process of making fun of it. Ah! I wasn't expecting to think so deeply about the human condition when I started this game, so I do have to say, Shak Fu definitely surprised me. Overall, if you can completely ignore the gameplay, audio, visuals, character roster, presentation, control scheme, content, and performance of Shak Fu, it's not that bad, and I recommend giving it a go if you're a fan of self-inflicted torture. And with all of that being done, I think I need to now have my eyes checked after looking at all those pixels. If I had to pick one of these games to recommend over the others, I'd have to go with Killer Instinct, although the King of Fighters 95 is a very close second. Despite the Game Boy being about as powerful as the willpower of a serial alcoholic, I'm really glad that game developers back in the day created fighting games for the system, as all of these games are now part of Game Boy history. I had a blast playing all these games to record footage for this video, and I hope you had fun watching. All of these games are super easy to emulate on both computers and smartphones, so there's nothing stopping you from experiencing them if you want to, and I'd suggest giving them a go. Okay, I'm gonna head off now and take a shower to expel Shaquille O'Neal's sheer aura from my body, so I hope you stay safe and join me in the next video. Thanks for watching.